we're so happy to have Brian on our faculty. We're so happy that he's teaching for us, and we're super happy to have him here today. So I'll get out of the way. I'm in a fairly remote location, so I'm going to stay on, but I'm going to stop my video and my mute so I don't cause static for everyone else. So Brian, take it away, and thank you so much.
Totally my pleasure, and the thanks right back to you, Bill, and Jeremy, and to the team at the center for this opportunity to share these ideas. I have thoroughly enjoyed the other presentations that have been made thus far. Just so impressed with the discussions that have been had here. So as introduced, my name is Brian Gursky, and I teach the Social Enterprise and Community and Economic Development in the EMPA program, and it's just been a fantastic experience. I have absolutely loved working with the students in these classes. Just such phenomenal individuals who bring a tremendous amount to our discussions, and of course, a lot of this happens too with the support of the Pickens Center. So, today I'm going to slightly step to just the side of my course topic on social enterprise and move to a related field of small business. And I wanted to bring this topic out when Jeremy had told me that the focus was really learning about the impacts of COVID-19 in all of our respective fields. And I am the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at a community development financial institution, a CDFI. It's called True Fund Financial Services. The organization is based in New York City. We have field offices in Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. Lots of work now happening in Georgia. We have a microloan fund in upstate New York, and we are focused on minority-owned small business. Areas of focus for our organization really is around business growth. We focus on contracting minority small businesses. That really means those that contract with city, state, federal government. And also around the areas of resiliency, as a lot of our programs in the southeastern region of the United States really began to support small business communities through natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, more recently Hurricane Harvey, and the Great Flood in Baton Rouge 2016, and a number of areas. And so, my own background, even prior to True Fund, has been in small business. I was a director of a small business development center that had started really after 9/11, and was a part of many different initiatives in the city in helping businesses respond to disruption, disaster, help them through the recovery process. So when I look at the COVID-19 pandemic and New York State on pause, I probably, like you, have just really read the heart-wrenching data about the impact on our small business community. This may be something that affects you in a variety of ways. As a consumer or a patron of a local small business, you may have a small business yourself. You may have family who is in small business. Both of my parents were small businesses. Haven't had to think too hard about how I got into this industry. But when I look at my work in the area of financing and advising and technical assistance, and really being a important, very deliberate part of the small business ecosystem, I wanted to share some lessons that I feel we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are some things that we might be able to apply really from an ecosystem perspective to really improve resiliency, the ability of the small business community to sustain disruption. I'll start off here by saying that this disaster is, of course, of a proportion beyond what had routinely been in practice when we were thinking of scenario planning and how to help businesses deal with a major customer that was lost, or a localized flood. Hurricane Sandy just recently passed through New York a number of years ago. There was a lot of assessment around that, but still we do continue to fail to have imagination on how large and far and wide disasters can go. Very famously, the preparation for Hurricane Katrina with federal, state, and local stakeholders in New Orleans, they did their scenario planning off of a Category 3 hurricane, and their assumptions were based off of levees not breaking. And then they went to work on thinking about how to handle that situation. Well, lo and behold, we know how history so brutally and sadly played out. And here we are, and yet a disaster of unprecedented proportions. And that still should not excuse us from thinking about how can we do this better? And how is it that for all of the robustness of New York City's small business ecosystem right now, which my organization is very much a part of, what might we still be getting wrong about moving the needle on helping businesses overcome disruption? So that's really where my discussion comes. The paper that I had provided for your intellectual digestion there. And I want to share a few points from the paper. I'll go ahead and I will walk through these, but I want to be mindful of keeping our discussion in a way that I think is just useful for all of us. So I'm going to try to keep my comments only a portion of our time together, and I would love to hear about your questions and concerns, observations you've had, and really join in a discussion about this. Probably as you sense, I'm very much going to be speaking from the perspective of a practitioner, not per se a policy perspective. I think it's important that we look at this from a ground level and from a practical application level. So that's really where I want to center my discussion. Consequently, those are the references I make in my presentation. So I have a PowerPoint I'm going to go ahead and I'll switch to, and I'll walk through a few of these slides. So the primary topics here, as I'm just switching, are going to cover New York City's small business community. I just want to share a few perspectives on that. I want to talk a little bit about the highlights of what we're seeing so far from the impact of COVID-19. I want to make notes really about what's really defining and shaping the New York City ecosystem at this time. And then lastly, and with some ways that we could possibly improve on this notion of resiliency. So there's New York City is an incredible amount of small businesses. Anyone who has just even stepped right out onto 116th Street and Broadway or Amsterdam just immediately gets a sense of how important, defining, distinctive this community is. 220,000 small businesses, 98% of which have less than 100 employees, but 89% of which are very small, fewer than 20 employees. And so this is a small business city. New York City has the highest number of minority-owned small businesses per capita of all major cities in the United States. Yes, the issues that I'm talking about, I'm sure, are relevant to many major cities around the country. But when it comes down to where I put a lot of emphasis, which is on minority-owned small businesses, New York City stands out in that regard. Minority-owned small businesses, Black, Latinx, Asian-owned, comprise a third of New York City's small businesses. And they are nearly half of all the small businesses in our two most diverse boroughs, which is the Bronx and Queens. I have a few references I want to share about those two boroughs throughout the presentation. But when we're talking about minority-owned small business, that just gets attention from multiple different sectors, and I don't want to assume that everyone on this call is well-versed in small business development, well-versed in minority-owned small business, but you're going to hear me speak a little bit about capital MWBE, Minority Women Business Enterprises, which is really relates to a certification that businesses get that helps them to get access to government contracts, federal, state, and city contracts, sometimes local, and that also plays into corporate supplier diversity as well. But more broadly, when we're thinking of minority-owned small business, we really are thinking of businesses that are just owned by an individual who is Black, Latinx, and the X, by the way, it just is a gender-neutral way of saying a Latino-owned or Latina-owned business and an Asian-owned business. And so that's a very distinct part of this discussion. You'll see why in a moment. Small businesses employ more than half of the, or about half of the private sector workforce in the city, and they're disproportionately high when it comes to employment in minority communities, predominantly minority communities. Local businesses hire locally. They hire proportionate to the local demographics of their community. So when we're seeing such a major role that minority-owned small businesses play in New York City, what we're seeing is actually a way that many minority-owned communities are employed. Small businesses, this sounds like a kind of a soft point, but there's just so much to be said about this. But they really are anchors of community stability. When you look at a sense of local ownership, a sense of identity that your community reflects you, when you see people who reflect you in a community who may very well likely also live in the community as a small business owner, and they are certainly drivers of economic vitality. In so many commercial districts throughout the city, it's distinctive, it's defining. And then lastly here, it's very important to say that small business really traditionally has been among the first few steps to economic opportunity for underserved community members, low-income community members, and I will also specify new immigrant communities within New York City. And when you probably think about our distinctive districts here around the city, there's areas that may be particularly, not just Latino, but Mexican or Colombian, areas that are not just Asian, but mainland Chinese or Taiwanese communities. So much of that comes from New York City really being a way for new immigrant communities to start businesses and really begin to improve economic mobility. Well, with rising rents in the city, access to small business opportunity has just been squeezed. If I were to be a little sensational here, I would say the American dream is dying in New York when it comes down to access to opening up a small business in New York. The costs of opening are so high, rent is so high that it just is really increasingly difficult to own and operate a small business. And when you can think decades back to someone who had started with that proverbial story of a few pennies in the pocket, able to open up a small business, and lo and behold, their children have gone off to Columbia's Executive Master in Public Administration program, those stories are ever more rare. So I bring that up because the loss of today's businesses does not necessarily mean that we get this destructive creation activity going and a business fails and another one immediately takes its place. I think it's important to see that access back into small business in New York City is very, very difficult. It's also important to look at small businesses as a source of wealth. And this is something that I think is largely under-addressed within the small business development sector. Small businesses are normally hailed as, understandably, as a source of an income, as a source of jobs. But small businesses actually are also a form of wealth. And within minority business communities, small business actually takes a dominant role, even in cases above home ownership for minority communities, particularly African American communities in the United States, which we know have had decades of government-sponsored suppression of wealth building. Please, just want to ask if everyone could kindly mute. Thank you so much. But small business has actually played a really predominant role in the form of wealth for minority communities within the United States. That absolutely holds true here in New York City. There's so much more to be said about viewing business through the lens of an asset, viewing small businesses as a form of wealth for a household. But that is a part of the devastation that we're seeing in New York City when you look at the wealth in a small business having to close or to shut down. The ability for a household to save back up for that wealth could be setting us back a generation. for those individuals. So that's another part of the value and importance of small business I want to start out with. I'll continue on here for a number of slides, and then I do want to make sure I have time to answer any questions that come up, but I really would encourage you to just please share any comments that come to mind as I share these. Go ahead and put them in, and I will be sure to read through those. The impact of COVID-19 is humbling. I do not do any justice to what I think is really occurring in the few of these data points, but needless to say, we're still just getting a sense of what is going to be the ultimate assessment of loss. So a third of New York City's businesses may close permanently. My data comes actually from a Partnership of New York City report, which is cited in my paper. But even just yesterday, the New York Times had an article pulling out actually a lot of these same statistics. And so that is something you could look at about how a third of New York City's businesses may be gone forever, I think was the title of the article. 85% of certified MWBEs said they likely cannot survive beyond the next 6 months. 30% of those MWBEs were likely to close within the next 30 days. An estimated 520,000 jobs provided by small businesses have already been lost. 500,000 jobs just from the small businesses cutting back, laying off employees, making painful decisions. And so it's needless to say here, this is a threat to livelihoods for employers, employees, erasing household wealth, and reshaping our communities. At the same time, New York City's small business ecosystem, which I've been working in for about 20 years at this time, I think we're certainly at one of our highest points in really giving emphasis to small businesses. I think that the concentration on small business has been significant even back into Bloomberg administration, certainly continued through the de Blasio administration. I will share my own observation that one of the most defining, corralling, influential forces in the small business ecosystem right now is the MWBE procurement goals that are set by New York City and state government. These are goals that 30% of city and state spending needs to be on minority and women business enterprises. And so that has been something that has been stepped up over the last number of years, both Cuomo and de Blasio administrations. It has mobilized resource providers, resources, so much attention within the small business ecosystem in New York City that I cannot help but put that right at the top of something that's been particularly influential. There, in New York City, another thing to pull out for us here is that there are federal organizations such as SCORE, Small Business Development Centers. There's state entities, which are entrepreneurial assistance centers. There's city organizations such as business solution centers. They're called technical assistance providers. I'm not a fan of the term, but that's the industry speak here for training and one-on-one advising for businesses. So we have multiple levels of government organizations that provide direct assistance to businesses. There's robust training programs in the city. Community colleges, universities partner with government and major corporations. There's Goldman Sachs 10,000 small businesses. There's strategic steps for growth at NYU. Columbia has a CU Grow program that's done in conjunction with Turner Construction. So lots of training programs. There's an active network of advocacy organizations, chambers of commerce, BIDs means business improvement districts, merchants associations, and there's also a plenitude of organizations that provide alternative forms of capital if a bank cannot go to a mainstream financial institution. So these are just a few things that really distinguish our ecosystem. But nevertheless, many businesses went into the COVID-19 crisis already distressed and or at risk, according to some categories by the New York Federal Reserve when it came down to some financial indicators of those businesses. The median small business held only 27 cash buffer days in reserve. In other words, they only had cash to support 27 days of operation. Many businesses had smaller than that. So businesses really just did not have resources to fall back on. And when you reflect on those statistics about MWBEs, 30% of which think they're going to close in the next 30 days, cash reserves have a lot to do with that. And Black and Latino-owned small businesses are largely shut out of such programs as the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. Even if you are not in small business development, your eyes may very well have crossed that term in some of our highest profile attention here nationally about how to help the small business community. But that's because there's a struggle for Black and Latino-owned businesses still to access banking relationships. They may not have qualified because of the number of employees that they had, or they did not get enough because of the number of employees they had, and certainly the size of the business. And so they just really were not able to access these programs at all, if not also sufficiently. So with all at stake, resiliency really is something that I think we're seeing we need to improve on. Resiliency is the ability, in essence, to survive and overcome challenge and adversity. Looking up a variety of definitions out there, something returning to its original shape. But I think in small business, we tend to think of it as really about being able to adapt, to change, to recover, and be able to get into the new norms that lie ahead after a disaster. So for the Rockefeller Foundation has put a lot of attention in the past on resiliency, but particularly with cities. That was their emphasis. They had chief resiliency officers in cities around the country. And so they looked at resiliency acting in response to different types of adversity, acute shocks, such as natural or man-made disasters, chronic stresses, such as systematic disinvestment in communities for small businesses. That could be just the chronic stress of reducing profitability over years due to rising rents and other costs of business. So think of small business resiliency, really kind of a long 3 steps. Getting businesses to a state of readiness. Think of cash reserves, access to insurance, getting their people and their plant up to a level of not being vulnerable, having a disaster response plan, in other words, knowing how to take action, access those resources, qualify for those programs, batten down the hatches, communicate with your customers, etc. And then thirdly, really having a plan and the ability to recover and adapt and adjust to new conditions afterwards. And you're probably aware of so many businesses are having to really reinvent themselves, let alone just add on new products and face masks and PPP, et cetera. Businesses are really having to get, cloud-based, online, remote, from yoga classes all the way to manufacturing, wholesale trade. So, this is really what we need to look at on if we're going to make a difference in resiliency. So I pick on a few things within our ecosystem in New York and applying that lens of how I see resiliency. I want to pinpoint the MWBE program. I want to share a few thoughts about network of resource providers. I want to share a few thoughts on the impact metrics and productivity, the impact and productivity metrics that we normally use to exchange funding for programs, and then a note on financial inclusion. And then I'll stop from there, and I'd really love to hear your comments and questions after this. So first, the MWBE program. So I've talked a little bit about what this program is about. It actually is, it has its decades in the making and really a part of our ecosystem, but the aggressiveness of these goals to get to 30% utilization of minority and women business enterprises. And by the way, that's a dollar figure, not a number of MWBEs, but the dollar expenditure on certified minority and women business enterprises has been probably the single greatest rallying cry of our small business ecosystem, perhaps statewide as well. And at New York State is at 29, over 29, close to 30% now. New York City still, it has a letter grade of a C on the whole across all of the, um, the agencies in the city. But many MWBEs, given all this attention on MWBE procurement, many MWBEs had just started really to just have an entrepreneurial opportunity at hand, get a business going, and start going after those contracts. Other businesses that may have been in establishment before redirected their businesses to get into the MWBE program. And so, you know, a lot of businesses have really realigned themselves to partake in this, to obtain these opportunities. And by the way, I also want to share here that the MWBE program really is about a capital D disadvantaged business, which has its root at the federal level in distinguishing what a disadvantaged business is. And the intention of these programs is really to address traditionally disadvantaged business communities, including women and minority business owners. So, you know, there's a higher goal than just 30% utilization at play here. So as I said that many businesses started their business to take advantage of this program or redirected their business to take advantage of this program, I would posit that there's both an opportunity and a responsibility to not just meet these utilization goals, but to really ensure that this program is yielding strong, stable, and enduring businesses. You can have a business meet its utilization goals or really contribute formidably to those goals, but you still may not be ensuring that that business can demonstrate strength, good practices that really help these to be, let's just say, multi-generational businesses that really not just provide income and jobs, but really also wealth. So alongside mobilizing resources to meet contracting goals, attention can be paid to resilient practices such as customer diversification, helping businesses to be more profitable on these contracts. This is not the case for all contracts, but for many contracts, it's not unusual to meet businesses that struggle with profitability on government contracting. Which businesses really are encouraged to go after, but the profitability can be very low. This is the public sector. So, you know, the bids that are awarded, the proposals that get the contracts are the lowest and responsive bid. That's a industry language for the lowest and most responsive bid. Growing businesses, growing business assets, and really ensuring their scalability, which means really the ability to get larger. A lot of these things are just not checked. They're not a part of our dashboard that assesses whether the MWBE sector is succeeding or not. What we normally use is just really whether we're meeting our contracting goals. But nevertheless, this is a major influence in small business community, and so we really need to find a way to work resiliency into this. My next of these kind of points I've picked out of our ecosystem here is really diversifying the network of resource providers. I feel like this is an age-old point. There are many before me and many who I have learned from and watched in my career who've really just continued to emphasize this. So this is almost not a goal to meet once and you're done, but really an ongoing priority. And that's really to look beyond formal resource providers really to an unconventional set of the stakeholders in small business. So what I say here is that federal, state, and city resource providers that I had listed before, they're somewhat numerous. They're represented geographically. They've kind of checked the box of each of the 5 boroughs. They have even different languages on staff. They really work to get outreach out to the community, but nevertheless, there's still a last mile that is not being crossed when it comes down to reaching out to the diverse businesses we have culturally and linguistically in the business community. And we've seen the result of this painfully as businesses have been left out of government assistance programs. In my paper, I say that only 1% of New York City's Small Business Continuity Loan Fund, which was I believe, a $40 million loan fund, was actually successfully deployed in the Bronx. Only 1% of those loans went to the Bronx. And And so we still see so many demonstrations of how we're just not getting far out enough into the business community. And we really need to think about what it means to meet a business community halfway. We think that just because we've set up a formal federal, city, or state resource center in a community does not mean that that community is going to be able to get all the distance to availing themselves of those services. So I note here that we need a more holistic and I'll also add in unconventional set of community stakeholders that are empowered and really counted as a part of the ecosystem. We can't just stop with our SBDCs and our business solutions centers and our entrepreneurial assistance centers. We need to look to civic and cultural centers, faith-based organizations, family associations, social service centers, public schools, public libraries, formal and informal community leaders and representatives to really help get the word out and make sure that we're going the full distance to helping the business community. And that is something that I really have seen, unfortunately, not done well enough when we're trying to get the word out about programs, whether it's at one particular CDFI or federal programs, city or state programs. We still are only reaching so far. My next point, this is my second to last point here. I'm just looking at the time, is rebalancing impact and productivity metrics. So this is very much a practitioner's point of view. But really what supports our resource centers for the business community, those who are on the ground, delivering training, delivering financing, delivering advisement and promoting programs, getting the word out there, we receive funding from government and from philanthropic organizations. And so when we get grants, when we get funding, what we give back is proof of our impact and our productivity. But those measures tend to be shorter term in nature and transactionally focused. I want to be very fair here, though, to say that impact measurement is very expensive. And especially when you're doing something more holistic and longer term. Longitudinal analysis is not something we always have change between our seat cushions to go do. That can be looking back to businesses 5 years back and seeing what they've been able to accomplish in time. That takes work and time, sometimes a level of sophistication and technology that organizations just don't have. And so a lot of our measures are designed to be what's achievable in terms of what we can measure, but they also tend to be transactionally focused. Examples would be, did we help them get a permit or license? Did we help them to start up and register their business with a legal entity? Did we help them to get a loan? Did we help them to get certified as an MWBE? Did we help them to get a contract with the federal government or a state government or city government? So many of these things are very transactional, and it's important. Accountability is important. You give an organization money, we want to make sure they're doing the work. But many of these measures that really drive the system are just not going far enough when it comes down to resiliency. So a few suggestions here at the bottom. We can measure such things as, has the business conducted a risk assessment? Have they obtained the proper insurance for all the things that they should have insurance for? Have they built up a cash reserve and determined how much they need? Have they diversified their customers and their suppliers? Have they written a disaster response plan? And importantly, are they ready to qualify for capital even if they don't need it at that time? So those are just a few examples of the kinds of metrics that I really believe need to enter in, not just a program specific funding, but that really need to be across the board accountability of whether we're doing good work for the business community. We haven't really gone far enough. We haven't succeeded. We haven't built a strong business community just by creating incomes, creating jobs, starting businesses or growing businesses. We really need to look at the strength of those businesses. My last point here, and then I'll really look forward to stopping and hearing from you, is really sustaining, if not stepping up, our prioritization around financial inclusion. Financial inclusion really refers to access to the formal financial sector, formal financial institutions. There's high cost and dangerous alternatives to mainstream financial institutions. There's also issues around access to capital, access to credit, being able to qualify for bank accounts or loans for your business. And there's also this very important element of financial literacy. We must never let up on this. And we're seeing businesses that have not been able to provide the right documentation for in order to be able to access the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. I'll throw a few more acronyms out there. The EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan out of the federal government. There's a New York Forward Loan Fund, which is at a state level. These and other programs still require walking through the front door of having financial statements, your tax returns, your financial documents for your business. Many businesses just didn't have them prepared yet. Many businesses didn't have them prepared at all. Many businesses just didn't keep good enough financial records. And also many businesses were just locked out of the PPP to begin with because they didn't have a strong banking relationship. And they weren't able to therefore be served by a bank who normally focus that program on their own customers. So financial inclusion needs to be at the center of small business resiliency. I just say in my third bullet point here, there's really this, you can get it, you can't get it, open, closed door, on, off switch approach to helping businesses really based off of whether they have or don't have their formal financial records. This is a problem that I do not want to oversimplify. There's lots of good reasons to ask for a business's formal financial statements. If you're giving a loan, even as a part of an emergency loan program, you don't just want to put a loan that has principal and interest payments on the shoulders of a business that you have no idea whether they could repay that or not, to be fair. But at the same time, just because a business doesn't have tax returns, just because a business doesn't have formal financial statements, because they aren't able to prepare or provide bank statements showing their financial activity, things that still are a part of a normal expectation, but for many, that's not available. So just because a business doesn't have that doesn't mean that they're not providing jobs. Doesn't mean that they're actually a source of income and wealth for a household, or that they're actually providing vital services and products for a local community. We can't just leave these businesses out. And right now, they're just shut out of the system by and large. And sadly, I believe many of these businesses are just going to disappear. They just weren't able to be helped, and we're going to lose so many of those businesses. And financial literacy, nevertheless, is, or important to say here, is also an ongoing priority. And that really means, how do you manage your financials for your business? What does it mean to be profitable? How do you interact with the mainstream formal financial system? How do you make sure your small business activity is really translating into financial security and wealth for your family? These are among the topics that would be included in financial literacy education. So that's my last point. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I really appreciate you letting me go just kind of on a run with these points. And just want to say, though, that the small business, the ecosystem should not just be defined by its quantities. I think we really need to be measuring its qualities. And what I mean by that is we can meet our utilization goals, we could start up businesses, grow businesses from kind of a top line, short-term indicator perspective, but we really need to look at whether we're building strong businesses. And despite years of that really have been characterized by prolonged, sustained economic growth, COVID-19 has ripped open the lid in ways that the mainstream has just not seen before or really looked before, to realize that our minority communities and minority business communities have long been vulnerable, unprepared, and isolated. And they are paying the price dearly at this time. And so if we recognize that the whole system, or that the whole value of small businesses play in economic and social well-being, and that if we have a desire as an ecosystem to be inclusive and equitable, then we just really need to make sure that we're building enduring businesses and not just mini businesses. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to hearing your comments and questions. So thank you so much.
Professor. So we have some questions in the chat. Not sure if you put questions, you'd like to say them out loud, or you prefer I say them.
Yeah, I'm going to open up that window right here. Thank you, Jeremy. And but that I'm just going to scroll back here for a little bit. And Bill had asked a question right here at the top. What role does the business improvement districts play, if any, in helping small businesses succeed? So business improvement districts, I had quickly noted them when I was talking about the different stakeholders in our ecosystem. So business improvement districts are set up by New York City government. They're managed out of the New York City Department for Small Business Services. And so, BIDs really are there to manage a certain geography. They are focused on a particular district. They're focused sometimes on a block or a set of blocks, and they're really there to help advocate for businesses, measure their needs, and make sure that those needs are being heard and being met. They look not really just business by business, more so they are looking at kind of a sector as a whole, and they really want to help that commercial corridor to thrive, get more robust because of all the reverberatory effects that it has in that local community with some of the things that I had talked about. So in this time here, BIDs, I think, have a really important responsibility to get an assessment of what is happening and report to the ecosystem, to the city and other stakeholders, what needs are, what the status is, what the health check is on those businesses, and to really act as a conduit for getting those resources out, whether it is a small business development center or a community development financial institution or another resource, really making sure that they are a bridge to that for information and resources. Next question here is there any documentary quantification showing the benefits the stakeholders supporting agencies and institutions have had in helping small businesses stay afloat? So, when I hear the word agencies, I'm thinking of government agencies, different agencies that contract to small businesses. And yes, I will say that community development financial institutions, and this is going to sound somewhat self-serving since I work with very proudly work with a community development financial institution, a CDFI. That acronym used to be so elusive and unknown and even reconfigured for decades since the founding of our type of entity in the United States in the 1970s. But CDFIs in particular have really stepped up to be really important conduits for the PPP program. And even to an extent that Congress even has set-asides for community development financial institutions to really deploy capital to particularly low-income, disadvantaged, and minority communities around the country. So our institution, there's more and more data showing about how we are getting more PPPs out to the business community, more capital out to the community, because we tend to be more local, tend to be more connected to our communities than, say, mainstream banks. So that is an entity I think is important to look at, and it's thankfully been recognized far and wide. I will also say, you look at what New York State is doing, New York City is doing, there's successes and there are setbacks, to be real about it, on both entities. I just noticed that, or noted that different agencies have failed to get capital out to high need communities, and those problems are complex, but nevertheless the resource was there, but they just didn't get out in the way that we know that they should. How do you think True Fund or other CDFIs pooling borrowers, excuse me, I'm just reading out loud, everyone, let me just make sure that I understand the question here. Borrowers purchases together to increase purchasing power and thus lower costs for small businesses. Yep, CDFI has 10 grocery store and small business. Yep. So this is almost a note almost about cooperative structures and really helping businesses to act together and purchase in bulk. Now, Pavan, I appreciate that question. That is something that has existed in thought and conversation, and to an extent in practice for a while. I think that as a small business community, Cooperative structures are not only there to help lower costs for businesses, but that's also maybe a way that business owners can exit and sell their businesses to employees. But what you're referring to particularly is how businesses can band together to buy in bulk from a supplier, let's say, and therefore get lower costs. Yes, businesses can and should do that. You should also look at who the promoting organization is for that. Is that a local community-based organization, a BID? Is it a merchants association? But the other thing I would say too is that right now you see businesses forming their own de facto communities to group together buyers, not just suppliers. To share employees, to help distribute information to each other more more quickly, and in a way that is more relevant. And there's lots of examples of businesses really banding together to act that way. I notice that that's the business community acting on its own. That's self-organization. That's not necessarily promoted by government or a community-based organization. But I also have to ask the question, to what extent can entities, government, community-based, nonprofit, really be more involved in helping to group businesses into this way? But often, our paradigm has normally been helping one business be more competitive against all the other businesses out there. But I think we need to really shift our paradigm and our mindset more to reviewing or viewing businesses together as a community, acting together and realizing that one business succeeds because it has retailers on one end, suppliers on another end, accounting offices and professional agencies as sideline supporters, and to realize that businesses exist in a business community. All right, next question here is, how do you prefer the training of small businesses, business owners? How do you train the small business owners to prevent their financial risks? So the one thing is the content, but here's a problem. And this is something that I think is a part of our human condition, is that training on risks and training on resiliency is almost a negative benefit. What that means is that you only get the benefit from that training if something bad happens. Now, so much of our work is going towards an opportunity, starting up, growing, getting a contract, going after financing to expand. That's more easy. There's more motivation there. But how is it that we can create not just the good rule by rule set of what is the do's and don'ts of insurance and scenario planning for your business, but how do you do this in a way that's motivational, that's compelling, and that really helps us to act in response to the risks? Right now, it's in our face, but come a year or two after this, we've seen that things can fall away and back into getting busy again we go. Right now, last crisis we can think of is the 2008 financial recession. That was a long time ago. And in our short-term memory, we have a hard time drawing those things back out. So we do need to find more effective ways, not to just get the right content there, but to try to find the right motivational way to do it. Because businesses are busy. They have to prioritize. They have to handle the swashbuckling day of their quotidian life here, but we need to get the incentive to be able to participate. Next question here is, do we know the ways in which, if any, international travel restrictions influenced by the introduction of COVID affected immigrant small business owners? For example, were immigrants more likely, I'm so sorry, I actually just jumped my screen here, were businesses more likely to return to their home countries to reunite with family during the beginning of the pandemic, leaving NYC businesses behind for what they thought would be short-term. So it's when you note new immigrant business communities in particular, I really appreciate that. That is such a important part of New York City's business community. I have talked about African-American owned businesses. I have also talked about Latino owned or Latinx owned businesses, Asian owned businesses, and the diversity extends from there. Those are just the categories right now that the programs are focused on. That doesn't mean that there are not others. But there is active trade, whether it is by suitcase or by cargo container. There are goods and services that make their way into New York City to be distributed and supportive to our new immigrant communities here, whether that is food products or blue jeans or other products. The other thing, though, is that there was some disruption in trade, especially from countries where there were more severe lockdowns, like China. I had a business owner who immediately reacted and diversified to a supplier very swiftly and in a very forward-thinking way. But not every businesses had that luxury to go and immediately go to Singapore to diversify a supplier, or Thailand rather. I'm sorry. And so this has impacted businesses not from a functional trade aspect, but also from a ability to operate aspect. We all know this is a global pandemic. We could speak with our colleagues in Bogota, Colombia, and on Zoom, they're wearing a mask. They're not able to operate in the same way. And so business communities here, new immigrant in particular, are in active transaction and connection with businesses abroad. So I know there's more to say on that, but I will add to. Well, I will wait for some more questions here. I have another one. How can accredited private investors finance or help CDFIs such as TrueFund, particularly if the private investors are okay earning a 0 to 2% of any investing? So there are incentives to invest in CDFIs, and this really came about in the 1980s and 90s, or 90s actually in particular, under Clinton, when the Community Reinvestment Act got more teeth. The Community Reinvestment Act regulates formal financial institutions, banks, to have a good record on the way they got capital out to low and moderate income communities, LMI communities. Banks have an assessment area. They are held accountable for the capital they get out to underserved communities, and they need to demonstrate that they took action to do this. A primary way banks do this is by giving grants or loan capital to CDFIs. CDFIs can include credit unions, CDFI credit unions, or loan funds like is TrueFund. There are 5 different types of CDFIs. And so the banks have an incentive to do that, or they get a poor CRA record, and that can affect their ability to open up branches. I'll also add, on the non-government mandate regulated side, increasingly CDFIs are getting rated by such organizations such as ERIS. We're able to compare apples to apples much better on which CDFIs are more effective or financial organizations are more effective. And so banks and private investors are getting a little bit more information, and we're beginning to see a little bit more investment from non-bank institutions because of the advent of rating institutions. ERIS, AERIS, is one such, and you can look that up and find more out about that. The other thing I'll say, though, is that bank foundations and private philanthropies grant money to CDFIs. We re-grant that money, re-lend that money. It funds our programs to get capital out. And so that's something I will also add. Here's another question. Are there good workforce training programs in NYC that aim to reskill unemployed SME employees and possibly shift them to another sector? So there's the New York City's Workforce One centers, which really act primarily as a clearinghouse for those that have jobs and those that need jobs. There's also grants that the city gives to small businesses to train their workforce. There are also entities such as labor unions that provide life-changing job opportunities and skilling opportunities. However, business entities that are helping to retrain this workforce right now that has been so abruptly laid off and in such large volumes, I do not have, from my perspective, the view that anyone is keeping up with this. I think right now there's still a hold your breath approach to this, that businesses will be able to come back into operation. New York City is now back into phase 4 with a few exceptions. And yet we're still seeing businesses operating at 10, 25% of their normal capacity. The workforce is not being absorbed yet. Businesses, the small businesses that employ the communities, first, I think, need to rethink their business models and really have resources and support to help them to diversify the way that they normally do business. There are businesses that are absolutely set up in such a way that this is going to be far more difficult. You know, restaurants and catering and others that are such in-person businesses, which, by the way, minority-owned businesses are disproportionately in those sectors. But there's also sectors that can adapt and adjust how they do a little bit easier. If those businesses can adapt and adjust, then their employees can be trained to help them adapt to that. I think that is actually a really good 1-2 punch on helping the business community through this, and the 520,000 that have been unemployed so far, to get reskilled. Help focus on what small businesses can do to change, to adapt, and then secondly, how their workforces need to be empowered, and make sure we provide the funding and the training to help them reskill. And it's not just going to be a patch. This is, there's so many terms here in competition to name this era that we've all been going through. And one of them out there is the Great Acceleration. And what that refers to is that this pandemic has fast forwarded our economy into a more remote, more digitally enabled, more cloud-based, more automated future. And that we knew was going to have significant impacts on the small business, or excuse me, on workers. But small businesses now, having been at the bullwhip, end of the bullwhip on this, are the ones who are seeing affected. So many other sectors and more skilled workers were able to adapt, but those others were not. There's more to say about this, but I hope that's a start in providing some perspective on it. There's another question here, is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many small businesses have been limited to takeout, referring to restaurants. How has the ecosystem of food delivery apps affected small business? And so thank you for the question here. And that has been a way a lot of restaurants have reacted to this crisis in particular. Yes, takeout has seen a bump. That might have moved. The revenue, the percentage of revenue that came from takeout, from 10% to 20% to maybe 25%. Overall, that bump has been far from sufficient to support small businesses. There's stories of even a takeout cocktails have boomed in this one restaurant in Brooklyn, in the article that I referred to at the beginning of today's presentation. Still a far cry from what they need to sustain their business. So takeout and the apps have been an important part, but there's been a lot of criticism about the fees for these apps when you've now just taken what was a peripheral income and now moved it into being a central income. Suddenly you start paying a lot more attention to those fees. And when major corporations are either granting or rethinking how they can support small businesses through this time, a lot of attention has been, or questions have been asked of those apps. What are you going to do? How are you going to reduce your fees? How are you going to support? Because now you are taking not just a percentage of a peripheral income, but now a percentage of a primary income. So businesses have actually been, I've seen this, you may have too, getting their own websites going and starting their own e-commerce platform. They're just bypassing the apps, go to them, you call them, they say, don't use the app, go to our website to try to bypass those apps. But that's, I also want to put this in context. This is really a survival. This is not a thriving option for businesses. But it is a good example of how all stakeholders, those app providers to city government to community-based organizations to lenders like True Fund and many others, we're all being asked, how are you going to help? What are you going to do? How are you going to adjust? Because landlords can't just play it the way they've always played it. They have to find a way to put a few months of rent unpaid now on the back end of a lease, negotiate that lease down for a temporary period. Everyone is being asked to chip in something to help us through this, because asking one business to bear the weight of this pandemic on their shoulders alone is impossible. And as I've noted in the presentation here, the consequence of the loss of business communities is not just the loss of economic vitality and diversity of our products and services in the city, things that define and distinguish us, but really the loss of household wealth. You can imagine how many years it will take to build back up the value of those businesses for these families. I see no more questions unless I'm mistaken. And I will go ahead and take a pause here and see if there's anything else anyone wants to add.
I think we can wrap up if that's all right.
That's just fine. 1:05.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. I've been taking notes the whole time. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. You can find the paper online on the guest lecture site. And thank you again, Professor Kretzky.
It's totally my pleasure. So grateful to have the opportunity to engage like this, and I wish everyone well, and look forward to seeing the next presentations. Thank you again.